In the early hours of October 2nd, 2003, a quiet apartment building on Mountain Avenue in Winnipeg, Manitoba, became the scene of one of the city's most haunting unsolved murders. Inside a modest third-floor suite, 3 young children were asleep, unaware that their lives were about to change forever. Their mother, 32-year-old Nicolle Hands, was awake only a room away, facing an unimaginable terror that would end her life. At around 3:30 in the morning, neighbors later recalled hearing noises, a struggle, a woman's voice, and then silence. Within minutes, a babysitter inside the home, along with Nicolle's eldest child, discovered that something terrible had happened. When police and paramedics arrived, they found a chaotic and devastating scene. Nicolle had been violently attacked and left critically injured. The children, frightened and confused, were quickly taken from the apartment as emergency crews worked to save her life. She was rushed to the hospital in grave condition, and detectives from the Winnipeg Police Service Homicide Unit were immediately called to the scene. There were no signs of forced entry, which led investigators to believe that Nicolle had willingly allowed her attacker inside. The building's hallways were quiet, and no one had seen a stranger enter or leave at that hour. Word of the attack reached Nicolle's family hundreds of miles away in Kingston, Ontario. Her mother, Eleanor, received a call from a doctor at the hospital, explaining that her daughter had been found unresponsive after a violent assault. Eleanor pleaded with him to keep Nicolle alive until she could arrive. She traveled to Winnipeg as quickly as possible, bringing Nicolle's 2 oldest children with her. The hospital room was filled with heartbreak, a mother's desperate hope, and 2 young children who could barely comprehend what had happened to their mom. Nicolle survived for 3 days, but her injuries were too severe. On October 5th, 2003, she passed away in the hospital, surrounded by family. Her death officially transformed the investigation from an assault into a homicide. Police began canvassing the area, collecting statements, and searching for anyone who might have seen or heard something that night. But as the hours turned into days, no suspect was identified, and no one had a clear explanation of what led to the attack. That early morning on Mountain Avenue marked the beginning of a case that would confound detectives for decades. A young mother was gone, 3 children were left without their parent, and a community was left to wonder who could have committed such an act. The answers would prove to be elusive, and the mystery of what happened to Nicolle Hands would haunt Winnipeg for years to come. Before her name became tied to one of Manitoba's most mysterious unsolved murders, Nicolle Hands was known simply as a devoted mother and a loving friend. Born in Kingston, Ontario, in 1971, she was remembered as kind, warm, and determined. Friends said Nicolle had a quiet strength, the sort of resilience that showed through in her ability to handle life's challenges without complaint. After moving to Winnipeg, she built a new life for herself and her 3 young children, determined to provide stability and safety in a city that, while not without its dangers, offered her a fresh start. Nicolle lived in a small 3rd-floor apartment at 271 Mountain Avenue, a modest building in Winnipeg's North End. The area was working class, with narrow streets, older homes, and an eclectic mix of families and tenants. Neighbors often saw Nicolle walking her children to nearby schools or chatting with residents in the stairwell. She had recently started working part-time, balancing her schedule between her job, raising her kids, and trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. To most who knew her, she was quiet but friendly, a woman who stayed focused on her children and avoided trouble. However, in the months leading up to October of 2003, Nicolle confided in a few close friends that she had been receiving unwanted attention. Some reports later suggested that she knew her attacker, though police never publicly confirmed this detail. Those close to her recalled that she sometimes seemed uneasy at night and occasionally mentioned feeling as though she was being watched. Despite this, she tried not to show fear in front of her children. Her priority was always them, making sure they felt safe and loved inside their small apartment. Investigators later learned that the days before the attack had been relatively routine for Nicolle. She'd gone grocery shopping, taken her children to a local park, and made phone calls to family back in Ontario. Everything about her life appeared stable. On the evening before the assault, she reportedly spoke with her mother, Eleanor, over the phone. They discussed normal things, the kids, work, and plans for the upcoming holidays. Nothing in that conversation suggested that Nicolle sensed any danger. It would be the last time Eleanor ever heard her daughter's voice. When detectives began piecing together her final hours, they faced an unsettling realization. There were no signs of a break-in, and nothing of value had been stolen. Whoever had entered Nicolle's apartment had likely been someone she trusted enough to let inside. Police began conducting interviews with neighbors, friends, and former acquaintances, hoping to trace Nicolle's recent interactions. Some neighbors said they heard muffled voices late at night, while others mentioned seeing an unfamiliar man in the hallway days earlier, a detail investigators could never fully verify. In the early stages of the investigation, police considered several possibilities. Was this a targeted attack motivated by personal conflict or a random act of violence? The absence of forced entry and theft suggested intent beyond robbery. Forensic investigators processed the apartment carefully, gathering fibers, fingerprints, and biological evidence using techniques available at the time. But early DNA analysis in the early 2000s was still developing, and the samples collected did not lead to an immediate match in any known database. By the end of October 2003, detectives had interviewed more than 30 individuals and reviewed countless tips, yet no suspect had been charged. Every detail of Nicolle's final days, from her grocery runs to her final phone call, was dissected in hopes of finding the missing link. For her family, the lack of progress was agonizing. They knew Nicolle's life had been simple and centered on her children, which made her murder all the more inexplicable. As weeks turned into months, the unanswered questions grew heavier. Who had Nicolle let into her home that night? And what had happened in those quiet hours before the attack? And why, after so much investigation, did no one seem to have seen or heard the person responsible? For Winnipeg police, the case was far from over. But already, the haunting silence surrounding Nicolle's murder had begun to set in. On the morning of October 4th, 2003, the quiet of Winnipeg's North End was broken by a chilling discovery inside a modest apartment building at 271 Mountain Avenue. Nicolle Hands' lifeless body was found in her third-floor suite by a concerned relative who had stopped by after being unable to reach her for several days. The scene that awaited first responders was deeply unsettling. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting that Nicolle either knew her killer or had willingly allowed them inside. Nothing valuable was missing, ruling out robbery as a motive. For investigators, it was clear from the start. This was a personal, deliberate act. Paramedics arrived quickly, but could do nothing to help. Winnipeg Police Service officers sealed off the entire floor, turning the small apartment into an active crime scene. Neighbors were questioned immediately. Many recalled hearing nothing unusual. No screams, no arguments, just the typical creaks and muffled noises of the aging building. A few remembered seeing Nicolle's children being taken away safely to stay with family members, while others said police moved in and out of the suite for hours, carefully collecting evidence. Within hours, the investigation had officially begun, one that would span years without resolution. Forensic teams worked methodically through the apartment. They documented every item, photographed every angle, and searched for fingerprints and DNA evidence using techniques available in the early 2000s. Blood pattern analysis and fiber collection were carried out in detail. Investigators collected clothing, personal items, and a series of small samples that could later be tested for DNA. At that time, however, DNA databases in Canada were still in their infancy, and technology lacked the precision it would gain a decade later. The samples were preserved, but results were limited. Still, detectives believed the key to solving Nicolle's case could one day be found within that evidence. Police spokespeople assured the public that the homicide was being treated with the highest priority. Detectives canvassed nearby apartments and the surrounding neighborhood for witnesses, hoping that someone had seen an unfamiliar person entering or leaving the building around the time of Nicolle's death. A few neighbors mentioned a man seen in the hallway in the days before the discovery, described only as tall, wearing dark clothing and possibly carrying a duffel bag. Unfortunately, this vague description was not enough to build a clear suspect profile. No one had seen the man enter or leave Nicolle's specific apartment on the night of the crime. The media began to cover the story widely across Manitoba. Headlines described the tragedy as both horrifying and deeply mysterious. Reporters noted how little police were saying publicly, and rumors quickly began to circulate. Some speculated about domestic issues or possible connections to acquaintances Nicolle had mentioned feeling uncomfortable around. Others theorized it might have been a random attack, though that seemed unlikely given the absence of forced entry. The case stirred unease throughout Winnipeg, particularly among residents in the North End who worried about an unknown killer still at large. Detectives soon brought in specialists from other divisions of the Winnipeg Police Service to assist. Criminal profilers were consulted, hoping to develop behavioral insights into the possible suspect. The lack of theft and the manner in which the apartment had been left suggested someone acting out of emotion, possibly anger, resentment, or obsession. This indicated the killer may have had a personal connection to Nicolle. Yet without hard evidence, police were left to rely on instinct and deduction. Dozens of interviews were conducted, and multiple people of interest were identified, but none could be conclusively linked to the crime. Meanwhile, forensic analysts continued processing the evidence. Technicians compared hair fibers, analyzed trace material, and examined possible fingerprints lifted from surfaces inside the apartment. Some prints belonged to Nicolle and her children, while others could not be matched to anyone in existing police databases. The uncertainty added frustration for investigators, who believed they were close to a breakthrough, but could not yet tie any single individual to the scene beyond doubt. By the end of 2003, the case had hit its first major stall. Despite extensive forensic work, neighborhood canvassing, and hundreds of investigative hours, no suspect had been charged. Police confirmed to local media that the case remained open and active, but behind the scenes, leads were drying up. The tragedy of Nicolle Hands' death had left a void in her family and a mystery in the city of Winnipeg, one that only deepened as winter set in and the case grew colder with each passing week. As the years passed, Nicolle Hands' murder remained unsolved, becoming one of Winnipeg's most haunting cold cases. The file, meticulously compiled by the Winnipeg Police Service, sat largely inactive for nearly a decade. Investigators had pursued every lead possible at the time, but the combination of limited forensic technology and uncooperative witnesses stalled progress. Many in the community feared that the killer might never be identified, and Nicolle's family struggled with the ongoing uncertainty. Her mother, Eleanor, kept a careful record of every development, saving clippings, police updates, and personal notes. A private archive of grief and determination. In 2012, a renewed effort came with the formation of Project Devote, a joint task force of the Winnipeg Police Service and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. This initiative focused specifically on cold cases involving missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. For Nicolle's case, Project Devote brought new resources, fresh investigators, and modern forensic techniques that had advanced significantly since 2003. Detectives re-interviewed former witnesses, visited the crime scene, and reviewed every piece of evidence with modern standards in mind. Even decades-old DNA samples were re-examined using more sophisticated testing methods. Investigators worked carefully to reconstruct Nicolle's social life in the months leading up to her death. They looked into her friendships, past relationships, and any known conflicts that could indicate a motive. Attention was paid to her involvement in Winnipeg's North End community, her connections through work, and interactions with people she trusted. Police also focused on her financial dealings, attempts to resolve personal disputes, and any indications of threats she might have received. Each detail was examined to build a clearer picture of her final days. Witness cooperation remained a challenge. Many people who had known Nicolle or been around her social circle in 2003 were reluctant to speak. Fear of reprisal, ongoing involvement in illicit activities, or mistrust of authorities created significant barriers. To overcome this, Project Devote investigators worked closely with community organizations to encourage safe reporting and provide assurance that any information would be confidential. They also reviewed statements collected during the original investigation, seeking inconsistencies or overlooked clues that might now be relevant. In addition to witness interviews, the task force employed behavioral analysis techniques to narrow potential suspects. Profilers assessed the likelihood that Nicolle's killer had a personal connection, given the lack of forced entry and the nature of the attack. They compared her case with other unresolved homicides in Manitoba, looking for patterns that could indicate a serial offender or someone with a history of violence. Investigators also traced people of interest who had been close to Nicolle around the time of her death, verifying alibis and searching for any inconsistencies. Technological advancements played a significant role in reopening the case. Crime scene photos were enhanced, fingerprints reanalyzed, and trace evidence retested using modern equipment. Digital mapping of the neighborhood and cell phone records were used to identify individuals in proximity to Nicolle's apartment on October 2nd, 2003. Investigators hoped that these modern tools could reveal something missed in the original probe. By 2014, Project Devote had conducted in-person interviews with Nicolle's surviving children, now young adults, and her mother Eleanor, traveling to Kingston to gather first-hand accounts. Their recollections, combined with the re-examined forensic evidence, provided new insights. Though no immediate arrest was made, investigators believed they had narrowed the suspect pool and were closer than ever to uncovering the truth. Despite these efforts, the case remained unsolved, highlighting the challenges inherent in cold cases involving intimate knowledge, fear, and limited evidence. Project Devote's work, however, ensured that Nicolle's story was never forgotten. The dedication of investigators and the persistence of her family kept the case active and visible, preserving hope that one day the person responsible for Nicolle Hands' death would be identified and held accountable. After years of painstaking investigation, Project Devote made a significant development in March of 2020. Investigators arrested a Winnipeg man in connection with Nicolle Hands' murder. This moment brought a surge of hope to her family, especially her mother Eleanor, who had been waiting for answers for nearly 17 years. For Nicolle's 3 children, now adults, the news felt like a long-awaited opportunity to finally confront the past. The arrest indicated that persistent investigative work, combined with modern forensic methods and community engagement, could bring new leads even decades after a crime. Despite the excitement surrounding the arrest, the relief was short-lived. Within 24 hours, the suspect was released due to insufficient evidence to formally charge him with Nicolle's murder. Investigators and Crown prosecutors concluded that, although the man fit aspects of the description and had potential connections to Nicolle's life, the case lacked the concrete proof required for a conviction. The sudden reversal was devastating for Nicolle's family, reopening old wounds and emphasizing the difficulties of achieving justice in cold cases. Eleanor described the moment as heartbreaking, particularly when she had to inform her grandchildren that the man they thought responsible was now free. The case highlighted several challenges inherent in investigating crimes like Nicolle's. The lack of forced entry suggested she knew her attacker, but the fear and silence within the community made it difficult to gather first-hand accounts. Witnesses often hesitated to come forward due to fear of retaliation or distrust of law enforcement. Investigators also faced limitations imposed by the passage of time. Memories faded, evidence degraded, and and potential suspects or witnesses moved away or passed on. These factors collectively made it difficult to create a fully substantiated case, even with the advantage of modern forensic techniques. Before the arrest, the Winnipeg Police Service had announced a restructuring, removing officers from the Project Devote task force to form an internal cold case unit. While collaboration between the RCMP and the local police continued, the change created uncertainties and slowed some investigative processes. The team worked under the understanding that every lead might be critical, but organizational changes inevitably affected the pace and strategy of the investigation. Despite these obstacles, authorities maintained a commitment to keeping Nicolle's case active, demonstrating the enduring importance of her story within the broader context of unsolved crimes against Indigenous women in Canada. Tragically, in late 2023, the primary suspect passed away. With his death, the possibility of achieving justice through a traditional conviction disappeared. For Eleanor and Nicolle's children, this loss underscored the limits of the legal system in cases where time, fear, and evidence constraints intersect. While the police consider the case technically still open, the reality is that the chance of a courtroom resolution is gone. However, investigators continue to hope that someone with information might step forward, even decades later, to help provide answers and closure to Nicolle's family. The unresolved nature of Nicolle's murder has kept public attention focused on the broader crisis of violence against Indigenous women in Canada. Her story is cited frequently in discussions about systemic challenges, the need for improved reporting, and community support. It serves as a stark reminder of the importance of dedicated investigative resources and the persistence required to tackle cold cases. Advocates argue that unresolved murders like Nicolle's emphasize the need for ongoing reforms in law enforcement and justice systems to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Nicolle's family continues to hold out hope for closure. Eleanor has made direct appeals to anyone with information, urging them to contact authorities and help bring some peace to a family that has waited far too long. Community leaders and Indigenous advocacy groups echo this plea, encouraging anyone with knowledge to come forward. While the path to justice may never be complete, the story of Nicolle Hands remains a powerful call for awareness, accountability, and the relentless pursuit of answers. Through all of the setbacks, Nicolle's memory endures as a reminder of a young mother taken too soon. Her life, her struggles, and her enduring love for her children continue to resonate. The case may be unsolved, but the dedication of her family, the investigators, and the community ensures that she is not forgotten. In the end, the story of Nicolle Hands is not just about a crime. It is about persistence, remembrance, and the hope that someday truth will prevail. Though the primary suspect in Nicolle Hands' murder has passed away, the case remains officially open with the Winnipeg Police Service. Investigators continue to monitor any potential leads, no matter how small, understanding that even decades later, new information can emerge. The ongoing attention highlights the importance of cold case units and the dedicated officers who tirelessly review files, interview witnesses, and analyze old evidence with modern technology. Each effort, whether reviewing surveillance footage, forensic materials, or witness statements, is aimed at answering the most pressing question: who killed Nicolle Hands and why? For Nicolle's family, the years of uncertainty have been a profound struggle. Her mother, Eleanor, has spoken openly about the emotional toll, describing the mix of hope and despair that has defined life since October of 2003. She has become an advocate for families of missing and murdered Indigenous women, emphasizing the critical need for systemic reform in how these cases are investigated. Eleanor's dedication to keeping Nicolle's story alive has inspired many in Manitoba and beyond to support victims' families and to encourage anyone with knowledge of such crimes to come forward. The tragedy of Nicolle Hands also sheds light on broader societal challenges. Cases involving Indigenous women often face additional barriers, including systemic bias, fear of retaliation, and community mistrust of law enforcement. These obstacles complicate investigations, delaying justice and leaving families in prolonged states of grief. Nicolle's story exemplifies the intersection of personal tragedy and social inequities, serving as a case study in the urgent need for increased awareness, resources, and community engagement. Her murder is a reminder that true crime is not just about sensational stories. It is about real people, families, and communities impacted by violence. In Winnipeg, Nicolle's 3 children continue to navigate life carrying the memory of their mother. As young adults, they have shared their experiences with investigators, journalists, and advocacy groups, hoping that their voices might help uncover answers. The children's willingness to speak openly about the case has provided investigators with perspectives that were unavailable at the time of the murder. It also ensures that Nicolle's story is remembered as more than a headline. It is a personal and ongoing narrative of love, loss, and the pursuit of truth. While no one will ever know the full details of Nicolle's final moments, her legacy endures in the lives of her children and the work of those dedicated to solving cold cases. Community outreach programs and Indigenous advocacy organizations continue to honor her memory, highlighting the urgent need to protect vulnerable populations and prevent future tragedies. Each anniversary of her death serves as a call to action, reminding authorities and the public alike that unresolved cases require vigilance and care. The story of Nicolle Hands has become emblematic of the broader movement to address violence against Indigenous women in Canada. For those following the investigation, the hope remains that someone, somewhere, may hold crucial information. Even decades after the crime, new technology, witness recollections, or previously overlooked evidence could provide breakthroughs. The police encourage the public to contact them if they know anything, reinforcing that it is never too late to come forward. Every piece of information, no matter how small, could contribute to finally bringing closure to Nicolle's family and holding the responsible party accountable. In reflecting on this case, it becomes clear that Nicolle Hands' story is about more than a crime. It is about resilience, memory, and the ongoing struggle for justice. While the legal system may never fully deliver the answers her family sought, their advocacy and determination ensure that Nicolle will not be forgotten. Her life and the mystery surrounding her death continue to inspire action, awareness, and a commitment to justice for others who have suffered similar fates. In the end, the case stands as a poignant reminder of the importance of remembering victims, supporting families, and relentlessly pursuing the truth. Though the investigation may face limits imposed by time and circumstance, the impact of Nicolle Hands' life and the efforts to uncover her story persist. Her memory motivates investigators, communities, and families to never give up hope. It is a story that speaks to the power of perseverance, the necessity of vigilance, and the enduring demand for justice in the face of tragedy. Nicolle Hands remains at the center of Manitoba's unsolved mysteries, a symbol of both loss and the relentless pursuit of answers that define the human quest for closure. In the early months of 1932, the small community of Elma, Manitoba, was covered in deep snow and bitter winds. The Sitar family, Polish immigrants, had settled on a large farm several kilometers outside the town. Martin Sitar, the family patriarch, had arrived in Canada in 1900, determined to build a prosperous life. Over the years, he had developed a successful farm, earning respect from neighbors for his hard work and dedication. Martin lived there with his third wife, Josephine, and their 5 children: Frank, aged 20, Walter, aged 11, Bert, aged 10, Jenny, aged 7, and the youngest, Paul, aged 4. The Sitar household also included Martin's nephew, Tom Hrexkosi, who had moved from Poland about a year and a half earlier to help with the farm work. He lived in the home, worked alongside the family, and participated in daily chores, blending into the rhythm of the household. Life on the farm was challenging and structured by the seasons. Yet the Sitars were known as a hard-working and close-knit family, respected in their community and bound together by shared labor and daily routines. The night of January 28th, 1932, began like any other frigid winter evening on the Sitar farm. The wind cut through the Manitoba prairie, and the snowdrifts outside made the farmhouse feel isolated from the rest of the world. Inside, the family settled into their nightly routine, tending to chores, preparing for bed, and sharing a final meal before the long night ahead. Martin, Josephine, and the children retired to their rooms, unaware of the horror that would soon descend upon them. Tom Rexkosi, the nephew who had been living with the family, spent that evening in his quarters in the loft above the main floor. According to later reports from investigators, he was awake long after the family had gone to bed, moving quietly and deliberately. In the early hours of January 29th, he armed himself with an axe and a large knife, tools that were common on the farm, but would be turned toward unimaginable violence. He began his attack while the family slept, targeting each member in turn. The violence was swift and catastrophic, leaving the Sitar family unable to defend themselves. Afterward, Rexkosi attempted to conceal his crimes by setting the farmhouse on fire. Large pieces of wood were used to barricade the front door from the outside, ensuring that the flames would trap anyone remaining inside and destroy evidence. The once proud Sitar home, a symbol of years of hard work and perseverance, was transformed into a scene of devastation, its roof and walls glowing against the pale winter sky. By dawn, the fire had attracted attention from nearby neighbors, though the full extent of the tragedy was not yet known. The isolation of the property, combined with the harsh winter conditions, delayed any immediate intervention. The scene that awaited anyone who approached would become one of the most shocking in Manitoba's criminal history, and the events of that night would set in motion a desperate search for answers and justice. As the morning of January 29th, 1932, broke over the frozen prairie, neighbors began to notice the smoke rising from the Sitar farmhouse. Martin's brother, John Sitar, who lived on a nearby property, was the first to realize that something was terribly wrong. He and two other neighbors hurried across the snow-covered fields, fear growing with each step as the orange glow of the fire reflected off the surrounding ice. When they reached the house, they found the front door inexplicably barricaded with heavy boards. Panic set in, and they used axes to force the entrance open, revealing the smoldering interior. Inside, the scene was one of chaos and destruction. The fire had taken a heavy toll, but amid the smoke and heat, the neighbors managed to locate 3 survivors: Josephine Sitar, 7-year-old Jenny, and 4-year-old Paul. Josephine was severely injured and died within minutes, despite attempts to provide aid. Jenny held on for about an hour before succumbing to her injuries, leaving little Paul as the sole surviving member. Paul, badly burned and barely conscious, was rushed to St. Boniface Hospital in Winnipeg. The young boy's survival was nothing short of miraculous, given the state in which he had been found. While medical staff worked to stabilize him, investigators began piecing together what had occurred. In his final moments, Paul reportedly whispered 2 chilling words that would change the course of the investigation. Tom did it. These words identified the family's trusted farmhand, Tom Rexkosi, as the primary suspect. Paul Sitar's whispered accusation became the central clue in a case that would grip Manitoba. His courage and presence of mind in those last moments provided investigators with a crucial lead, turning a tragic fire into a criminal investigation. The community was stunned that a man who had been welcomed into the Sitar home could have committed such a horrifying act, and the hunt for answers began in earnest. With the shocking accusation from 4-year-old Paul Sitar, authorities immediately focused their attention on Tom Rexkosi, the family's farmhand, and Martin Sitar's nephew. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police quickly organized a massive search effort, enlisting officers from Winnipeg and surrounding towns. The harsh Manitoba winter made the task even more daunting, with sub-zero temperatures, deep snow drifts, and icy winds sweeping across the open prairie. Every hour that passed increased the urgency as the community feared that Hrexkosi, if armed and desperate, could harm anyone he encountered. The investigation also relied heavily on local knowledge. Neighbors were asked to report any sightings of a man moving through the snow or seeking shelter, and teams combed the forests, fields, and rail lines surrounding Elma. The search stretched over 5 grueling days, with officers and volunteers enduring the freezing elements to ensure that Hrexkosi would not slip through their grasp. Despite the extreme conditions, they systematically covered every likely hiding place, from abandoned farm buildings to thick stands of trees. Finally, on February 2nd, 1932, Hrexkosi was found near a railroad track, about 18 kilometers west of Elma. He was weak, frostbitten, and exhausted from days spent evading capture. When confronted, he offered no resistance and appeared almost lifeless. His flight from justice broken by the relentless winter. His capture brought immediate relief to the terrified community, but it also sparked intense curiosity and fear. People wanted to understand why a trusted family member could commit such an atrocity and how he had managed to remain hidden for so long. Hrexkosi was transported back to Elma under heavy guard, and investigators began piecing together the timeline of the massacre. Every detail of the crime, from the planning to the execution, was scrutinized, and the authorities prepared to uncover the motivations behind a crime so shocking it would be remembered for generations. The community braced itself for the answers, though none could have anticipated the bizarre explanations that would soon come to light during the interrogation and trial. After Tom Hrexkosi was captured, the focus shifted to understanding why he had committed such a horrific crime. During questioning and psychiatric evaluation, he claimed that he had been influenced by supernatural forces, saying that he believed the devil had instructed him to kill the Sitar family. While his claims were unusual and difficult to verify, they raised serious questions about his mental state. Psychiatrists examined him thoroughly and concluded that he was suffering from a severe psychiatric disorder, casting doubt on his capacity to fully understand his actions. Hrexkosi's trial began on March 23, 1932, in the province of Manitoba. The case drew intense public interest, both locally and nationally, as Canadians struggled to comprehend how a trusted family member could become a mass murderer. Evidence presented during the trial included witness testimonies, the sequence of events reconstructed from the scene, and the critical statement made by 4-year-old Paul Sitar, which had pointed investigators toward Hrexkosi. The jury deliberated carefully, weighing the shocking nature of the crimes alongside the mental health evaluations. After 17 hours of deliberation, the jury found Hrexkosi guilty of 7 counts of murder. He was originally sentenced to death by hanging, but given the unusual circumstances surrounding his mental state and the questions about his sanity, the sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment in a secure psychiatric facility. Hrexkosi spent the remainder of his life there, dying in 1960. His case became a landmark example in Canadian legal history of how mental illness could influence both motive and sentencing in violent crimes. The Sitar family murders left a lasting impact on the small community of Elma and on the broader region of Manitoba. The tragedy became a symbol of the vulnerability of even close-knit, trusted families and a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk within familiar faces. Today, the story is remembered as one of Canada's most chilling mass murders, studied by criminologists, historians, and true crime enthusiasts alike. The memory of the Sitar family endures through community remembrances, historical accounts, and the lessons learned about trust, mental health, and justice in the wake of unspeakable violence. In the early months of 2022, Winnipeg was a city like any other. But beneath its ordinary streets and neighborhoods, a darkness was about to emerge. Jeremy Skibicki, a man in his late 30s, lived quietly in an apartment building in the North Kildonan area. To neighbors, he appeared unremarkable, reserved, keeping to himself, blending into the daily rhythm of the city. Few suspected that behind closed doors, a dangerous pattern was forming, targeting some of the most vulnerable members of the community. The first warning signs were subtle, almost invisible. Women who relied on shelters and transitional housing reported encounters with a man who seemed overly persistent and inappropriate, though nothing concrete was reported to the police at the time. These early interactions would later be understood as part of a calculated pattern, a chilling prelude to what would become a series of murders. By May of 2022, the consequences of his actions became horrifyingly clear. On May 15th, a scavenger at a residential site in North Kildonan discovered human remains in a garbage bin. The scene was immediately secured by the Winnipeg Police Service, who recognized the situation as a serious homicide. This initial discovery would mark the beginning of one of the most complex investigations in the city's recent history. Police quickly identified the remains as those of Rebecca Contois, a young woman of 24 and a member of the Ochi-Chakosipi First Nation. Her disappearance had gone unreported for several days, and the community was shocked and grieving. Investigators began to piece together the last known movements of Rebecca, retracing her steps from local shelters and community centers, and noting her interactions in the days before her death. Officers also began reviewing video surveillance and witness reports around the North Kildonan area, looking for any clue that could lead to her killer. It became evident that the man responsible had carefully planned his actions, exploiting the routines and vulnerabilities of his victims. For police, the case was not just a murder investigation. It was the potential start of identifying a serial offender operating in the city. Community members and Indigenous leaders quickly rallied, providing support to law enforcement and raising awareness about the dangers faced by vulnerable women. They also emphasized the ongoing crisis of violence against Indigenous women in Winnipeg, noting that Rebecca's case was tragically part of a much larger pattern. The discovery sparked conversations about safety, systemic issues, and the urgent need for protective measures. Meanwhile, forensic teams meticulously examined the crime scene. Evidence recovered at the bin and surrounding areas provided initial clues, including items that could be linked to the suspect, though nothing definitive yet connected a person to the crime. Investigators worked tirelessly, understanding that speed and accuracy were critical to prevent further tragedy. Following the discovery of Rebecca Contois' remains, investigators began building a clearer picture of the victims targeted by Jeremy Skibicki. It became evident that he preyed specifically on Indigenous women living in vulnerable circumstances, many of whom were connected to shelters or transitional housing in Winnipeg. These women were not just statistics. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, and friends with rich, full lives tragically cut short. Rebecca Contois, aged 24, was a devoted mother with a young daughter. She had grown up as a member of the Ochi-Chakosipi First Nation and was known in her community for her kindness and resilience. Family members described her death as a devastating loss, one that left a void impossible to fill. Her life, like those of the other victims, was a reminder of the personal and human toll behind the headlines. Morgan Harris, aged 39, was another of Skibicki's victims. A mother of 5 and grandmother of 1, she was from the Long Plain First Nation. Her family described her as fun-loving, fearless, and full of life, someone who brought joy to everyone around her. Morgan often faced challenges, but her resilience and warmth made her beloved by those who knew her. Her sudden death shocked both family and community members, highlighting the vulnerability of women in her position. Mercedes Myron, aged 26, was also from the Long Plain First Nation and a mother of 2 children. Friends and family remembered her as strong, nurturing, and fiercely protective of her loved ones. In the weeks before her death, she had been sharing hopes and plans for her future, moments that would now remain frozen in time. Her loss was a profound blow to her family, leaving behind grief that would never fully heal. The fourth victim remained unidentified for some time. Indigenous leaders referred to her as Mashkode Bijikiikwe, or Buffalo Woman, as a way to honor her memory and give her a place in the community. She was later identified in March of 2025 as Ashley Shingoose from St. Teresa Point, Anishinaabe Nation. Like the other victims, Ashley had a life, connections, and a story that ended far too early. All four women shared circumstances that made them particularly vulnerable. They relied on support services such as shelters, food programs, and community assistance. This reliance, tragically, made them targets for Skibiki, who exploited their situations with calculated precision. Investigators noted that his pattern focused on women who were socially marginalized, emphasizing the predatory nature of his crimes. Family members and community leaders played an important role during this period, working with law enforcement to ensure the stories of the victims were not forgotten. Each woman's identity, culture, and history were recognized publicly, underscoring the human aspect of the investigation. The community's involvement also helped police piece together the victims' routines, contacts, and last known movements, forming a critical part of the investigation. After identifying the victims, Winnipeg police launched an extensive investigation to track down the perpetrator. Early evidence pointed to the possibility that the killer had a detailed knowledge of his victims' routines and the city's systems for garbage collection and disposal. Investigators began mapping each victim's last known movements, shelter visits, and contacts, hoping to find a connection that could lead to a suspect. Surveillance footage from nearby buildings and public spaces was collected, reviewed, and cross-referenced with shelter records, marking the beginning of an intense and meticulous process. By mid-May of 2022, police had identified a 37-year-old man named Jeremy Skibiki as a person of interest. He lived in an apartment building near where some of Rebecca Contois' remains were found. Officers noted that his residence matched certain patterns in the crime, including proximity to trash disposal routes and shelters frequented by the victims. A search warrant was executed on May 18th, 2022, after which Skibiki was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Rebecca Contois. During interrogation, Skibiki's behavior was unexpectedly cooperative, yet chilling. Within hours, he admitted to killing 3 additional women whose deaths police were not yet aware of. He described targeting women who were homeless or transient, luring them to his apartment, and then committing the murders. Investigators quickly verified his account by matching DNA evidence from his apartment and personal belongings to the victims. Items such as clothing, knives, and personal effects linked him directly to Morgan Harris, Mercedes Myron, and Ashley Shingoose. The investigation revealed the timeline of the murders. Ashley Shingoose was killed around March 15th, 2022, followed by Morgan Harris on or about May 1st, and Mercedes Myron on or about May 4th. Rebecca Contois' murder occurred on or around May 14th, 2022. Skibiki explained how he had timed the disposal of bodies to coincide with local garbage collection schedules. Police determined that the remains of Harris and Myron were dumped in dumpsters that led to the Prairie Green landfill north of Winnipeg, while Rebecca Contois' remains were located both in a nearby dumpster and later at the Brady Road landfill. Officers also discovered that Skibiki had used online sales platforms to dispose of items connected to Ashley Shingoose, including a reversible jacket, which provided further evidence linking him to her death. The use of modern technology in combination with meticulous crime scene processing highlighted the investigative complexity of the case. Police worked with forensic experts to process each item, collecting DNA, fingerprints, and trace evidence to build a clear chain of connection. Throughout May and June of 2022, detectives conducted extensive interviews with shelter staff, friends, and acquaintances of the victims. They gathered details about who may have been in contact with the women in the weeks leading up to their deaths. Despite initial challenges, cooperation from community organizations eventually helped corroborate Skibicki's confession and establish timelines for each victim. The thoroughness of these interviews was critical in creating an airtight case for the Crown prosecutors. The investigation also examined Skibicki's past. Police discovered a documented history of violence, including prior incidents involving former partners. Social media activity painted a picture of deeply troubling beliefs, including racial hatred and disturbing views of women. Investigators noted that while he had no prior convictions for murder, the pattern of behavior suggested a highly organized and methodical individual. Jeremy Skibicki's arrest prompted a deeper examination of who he was and what motivated his crimes. Investigators and psychologists alike tried to understand how a seemingly ordinary man living in a Winnipeg apartment could commit such calculated and horrific acts. Skibicki had a documented history of violence, particularly against Indigenous women he had known personally, which indicated a long-standing pattern of abuse and prejudice. Police and forensic experts reviewed his online activity, noting a disturbing fixation on racist ideologies, misogyny, and violent content, which helped explain his targeting of vulnerable women. During court proceedings, Skibicki claimed that he believed he was acting on a divine mission, a statement examined carefully by mental health professionals. The defense presented a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, arguing that delusions had driven him to commit the murders. However, the Crown's experts, including Dr. Gary Chimowitz, disagreed, providing evidence that Skibicki was not psychotic at the time of the killings. Instead, he was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and substance abuse issues, combined with a highly disturbing paraphilic fixation. This diagnosis indicated that his actions were deliberate and premeditated, not the result of a temporary mental breakdown. Investigators also looked into Skibicki's personal relationships. He had lived alone for years, but police discovered he had previously been involved with women who shared similarities with his victims, often Indigenous women. These patterns, along with his online activity and history of controlling behavior, suggested that he had been grooming his environment and exploiting vulnerabilities long before the killings in 2022. His apartment became a central piece of evidence, containing objects and items directly linked to each of the victims. Forensic teams cataloged these items meticulously, ensuring that each piece would support the prosecution's case. Psychologists later testified that Skibicki's personality traits included a lack of empathy, impulsivity, and manipulative behavior. Combined with his obsession with control and dominance, these traits painted a portrait of a person capable of meticulously planning violent acts without remorse. While some reports referred to him as calm and even polite in everyday interactions, those closest to him noted a hidden intensity and volatile nature. The stark contrast between his public demeanor and private behavior made him especially dangerous. The prosecution emphasized how Skibicki selected his victims based on both opportunity and prejudice. Each woman was living in a vulnerable situation, often relying on shelters or temporary housing, which Skibicki exploited. He targeted them with precision, luring them into situations where he had complete control. His detailed knowledge of their routines and the city's disposal system allowed him to act with an alarming efficiency, highlighting the premeditated nature of his crimes. Experts also explored the social and systemic factors that allowed Skibicki to operate undetected for a period of time. Indigenous women in Winnipeg often face heightened risks due to socioeconomic disparities, systemic neglect, and barriers to accessing help. Skibicki's crimes brought national attention to these issues, prompting discussions about the need for increased protection, support, and awareness for vulnerable populations. In examining his motivations, investigators and court experts concluded that Skibicki's actions were a combination of deeply ingrained prejudice, a sense of superiority, and a compulsive need to dominate. Unlike other crimes of passion, these killings were executed with a methodical and chilling logic. Understanding his mindset became critical, not only for the trial, but also for broader law enforcement strategies aimed at preventing similar tragedies in the future. After months of meticulous investigation, the legal proceedings against Jeremy Skibicki finally began in May of 2024. The trial was held in Winnipeg and drew national attention due to the severity of his crimes and the broader implications regarding the safety of Indigenous women. Prosecutors presented an extensive body of evidence, including DNA links, digital footprints, and forensic analysis from his apartment. Each piece of evidence was carefully detailed to the jury, establishing a clear timeline of the murders of Rebecca Comtois, Morgan Harris, Mercedes Marin, and Ashley Shingoose. The prosecution emphasized that Skibicki had acted methodically, preying on vulnerable women while exploiting systemic weaknesses in social services and law enforcement oversight. During the trial, expert testimony played a crucial role in explaining Skibicki's psychological profile. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Gary Chimowitz testified that Skibicki exhibited antisocial personality traits, substance abuse issues, and a paraphilic fixation that contributed to the killings. The defense argued that he was not criminally responsible due to mental illness, specifically paranoid schizophrenia, but the Crown's evidence refuted this claim. Chimowitz's findings, supported by other experts, made it clear that Skibicki was fully aware of his actions and their consequences, reinforcing the argument for premeditation. On July 11th, 2024, the verdict was delivered. Chief Justice Glenn Joyal found Jeremy Skibicki guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder. The judge described the murders as mercilessly calculated and highlighted Skibicki's extremist views and deliberate targeting of Indigenous women. Skibicki, who remained largely emotionless throughout the trial, was sentenced to 4 concurrent life sentences, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The sentence ensured that he would not be eligible for release until he was 60 years old, providing the victims' families with a measure of justice for the first time. Following the verdict, attention shifted to the recovery of the victims' remains, a process that had been delayed for months due to limited resources and the locations of the landfills. In December of 2024, the Prairie Green landfill search began in earnest, and by March of 2025, the remains of Morgan Harris were positively identified. Later that same month, Mercedes Marin's remains were located and confirmed. These discoveries, while devastating, provided long-awaited closure for the families, allowing them to conduct proper memorials and funerals for their loved ones. The search for Ashley Shingoose's remains at the Brady Road landfill began in August of 2025, reflecting a continued commitment to honoring the victims and ensuring that no detail of the case was left unresolved. The aftermath of the trial also sparked wider public and governmental attention. Indigenous leaders and advocacy groups pushed for stronger protective measures for vulnerable populations, especially women living in precarious situations. Programs were reviewed to improve safety in shelters, address systemic discrimination, and increase collaboration between law enforcement agencies and social services. Skibicki's case became a focal point in discussions about preventing similar crimes, highlighting the need for awareness, education, and structural reform. Families of the victims expressed a mixture of relief and sorrow. While the verdict confirmed that the killer was behind bars, it could not undo the trauma endured by the victims' loved ones. Relatives described feeling a sense of validation and recognition after years of unanswered questions, but also the enduring grief of losing their mothers, daughters, and sisters. Their advocacy for justice continued, emphasizing that the case should serve as a reminder of the importance of protecting marginalized communities. In the broader context, the Skibicki case became emblematic of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis in Canada. It underscored how systemic neglect, vulnerability, and unchecked prejudices can intersect, allowing predators to commit horrific acts with relative impunity. Law enforcement agencies used the lessons learned to develop strategies for better identification of at-risk individuals and improve protocols for investigating violent crimes, targeting Indigenous women. With Jeremy Skibicki convicted and serving 4 concurrent life sentences, the story of the 2022 Winnipeg serial killings moved from the courtroom to the wider community, highlighting the profound social and cultural consequences of his crimes. The murders of Rebecca Comtois, Morgan Harris, Mercedes Myron, and Ashley Shingoose sent shockwaves across Manitoba and the entire country. Indigenous leaders emphasized that while one predator had been stopped, the broader crisis of violence against Indigenous women and girls remained urgent and unresolved. Advocates used the case to push for sustained government funding, policy reform, and community-led initiatives aimed at protecting vulnerable women and addressing systemic inequalities. The recovery of the victims' remains, completed gradually through the searches at Prairie Green Landfill and Brady Road Landfill, allowed families to conduct memorials and properly grieve. These ceremonies were both private and public, reflecting a blend of cultural practices and communal mourning. The community came together to honor the victims, emphasizing their lives, relationships, and legacies, rather than focusing solely on the horrific circumstances of their deaths. Each memorial became a symbolic reminder that these women were loved, valued, and deserving of recognition. The legal and investigative outcomes also prompted Winnipeg Police and Manitoba RCMP to reevaluate procedures for identifying and protecting at-risk populations. Changes included improved tracking of missing persons reports, enhanced communication with Indigenous communities, and better interagency cooperation to prevent individuals like Skibicki from targeting vulnerable people unchecked. Officers involved in the investigation reflected on lessons learned, acknowledging the importance of early intervention and culturally sensitive approaches in cold case investigations. On a societal level, the case ignited discussions about the intersection of racism, misogyny, and social neglect. Media coverage and public discourse highlighted the specific risks faced by Indigenous women, especially those experiencing homelessness or relying on shelters. Advocates stressed the need for culturally informed support systems, including mental health resources, secure housing, and community programs. The Skibicki case became a teaching point in law enforcement training, emphasizing the critical need to listen to marginalized communities and to act proactively when warning signs appear. Families of the victims, while experiencing a measure of closure through the conviction, continued to navigate their grief and trauma. They became vocal advocates for systemic change, attending public forums, speaking with policymakers, and participating in initiatives aimed at reducing the risk of similar tragedies. Their voices reinforced that justice is not only about punishing perpetrators, but also about protecting communities, empowering survivors, and preventing future crimes. Nationally, the 2022 Winnipeg serial killings contributed to renewed attention on the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry, reinforcing the urgent need for concrete actions and accountability. The case illustrated how systemic failures, ranging from gaps in social services to delays in law enforcement response, can compound the vulnerability of marginalized populations. It also highlighted the resilience and determination of families and communities advocating for safety, recognition, and justice. Even years after the events, the legacy of this case remains potent. Memorials, educational programs, and public awareness campaigns ensure that the stories of Rebecca, Morgan, Mercedes, and Ashley are remembered beyond headlines. Their names are now part of a broader movement demanding equity, safety, and dignity for Indigenous women across Canada. The Skibicki case, while uniquely horrifying, became a catalyst for societal reflection, advocacy, and ongoing reform, leaving a lasting imprint on Winnipeg and the nation.